Hi, everyone. Welcome to Potluck Food Talks. Today, we have a very special guest, Rebeca Pérez Gerónimo. She's a publisher, and we're going to talk about books.
Yes.
How are you, Rebeca?
Hi. Very nice to be here. Thank you for the invite. I have a lot of books around me, so I hope we can dig in and talk about them.
Yeah, we were also talking that you just were recently in Venezuela, and right now is a good moment to go because probably they're going to reactivate all the sanctions. So this golden age that we're living right now, it's going to get over soon. What are your impressions on that?
Yeah, it's very surreal. I actually recently started rereading 100 Years of Solitude. So Macondo and Garcia Marquez. And it reminded me so much of Latin American countries that are so surreal. So I've been living in Berlin for 8 years, and it was my first time coming back to Caracas. So I saw things differently from outside. And when I was there, it was like, this is so crazy. How can this be real? It's like a Macondo, of course. But yeah, I recommend very much traveling there right now. It was a really nice trip. Also, food-wise, I got to reconnect a lot with my roots. So it was really nice for me to go back and cook with my aunts and do hallacas, arepas.
Do you have any favorite Venezuelan food books?
Well, the Bible, so Armando Escanone, has taught me a lot because it's like a book that everyone had. No, like everyone had it at their homes.
For sure.
So I've learned a lot from that one in particular.
Yeah, like his recipes, I know by fact that, well, his recipes, he was like this kind of, I will use the word aristocrat, like living in a large house, and he had like this ladies that cooked at his house, and these were actually the makers of that book.
The cooks behind.
Yeah, but what he did is he measured everything with precision, and that's why his recipes are so good. So it's a great book, Mi Cocina of Armando Escanone, to anyone who wants to get into Venezuelan cooking.
Yeah.
Because the recipes just work, and that's why everybody had that book. It's also like a really good reference. And I think these kind of things are important. I had lunch a few months ago with Narda Lepes, and she was saying that everybody in Argentina cooks rice wrong because at some point there was some instruction somewhere, like in a rice package, that said that rice needed to be cooked like pasta, like with lots of water and then straining it. So everybody was cooking rice like that because of that.
That is funny.
So it's really important to like a good basis or a good reference.
But at the same time, like talking to my family, about recipes, because we did hallacas, which I don't know if you've discussed hallacas in your podcast, but it's this very difficult dish that requires a lot of work. So families get together and they all have their own recipe. But it's funny because I was asking them hi, give me a recipe. And it's they don't measure anything. They do have a reference of things, but they do not have this scientific or methodological thing of writing down and putting the numbers. So it's really difficult to get precisions in the kitchen from the family.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. No, you also mentioned 100 Years of Solitude. And it's funny because when I was thinking about doing this talk with you and talking about books and literature and food, that's actually one of the books that came to my mind. Because there are a lot, I wouldn't say recipes, but dishes that he mentions, and they give this whole layer to the book. And it's always I was making a soup and the soup had this and that, or someone cooked a soup that had this, and they just mentioned the main ingredients. And for some reason, I always remember soups with plantain in that book, in 100 Years of Solitude. And the other book that comes to my mind that has a lot of dishes inside is Don Quixote.
True.
And there has been a lot of, or at least a few, cookbooks about Don Quixote, about the dishes in Don Quixote. And I imagine all these Jews from Castilla and these kind of things, from Middle Ages. It's a nice way to document a time and place and a way to eat. And I think both books do a good job at that.
Yeah, I think when you start tracing back the histories behind dishes, it can give you a lot of context. It's something that we do every day. So any detail really tells you a lot about what's going on, or the environment in general. So also like the way people speak about like how they cook, it's interesting. It's like we were discussing this thing about storytelling that I'm very drawn to. I studied literature, so of course, like we're discussing books. And for me, the story behind the recipes or the story behind what we eat is the most important thing, or at least one of the things that excite me the most. Aside from cooking and eating, of course, but like the reading the stories is really, really important. I have a lot of memoirs that are centered in food, and I have a whole list that we can maybe like then start mentioning that we can recommend. It's in this simplicity and in this like very honest and intimate way of dealing with food that I am like super excited all the time, like with books in general.
Yeah, but before we start, I want to mention my favorite food author.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I told you, like, I just told you before the call that I started a food blog just a few, like maybe 2 months, maybe 3 months. I'm publishing one article each week just to keep my pen sharp, And it's a nice exercise because, I also learned to make them shorter. Now I'm writing just a 5-minute article. It's just like a quick topic, a quick mention on something. And I think that's also better to read for anyone. So in the whole process of getting into food writing, because I'm also doing narrative on a different project, but food writing is like a different thing. It's its own thing. And I would say my favorite author and the most influential for sure for me has been, when it comes to just food, is MFK Fisher. And well, I discovered her on a Japanese cookbook, and she wrote the prologue. And I remember reading this, and she was describing a soup, I think it was a soup with some dumplings inside or something, and it really reproduced the experience of eating this, like getting into the textures, the flavors, how they combine, and the experience of eating it, that I had like this almost, like sensory memory of having that dish, even though I never had it.
Yeah.
And I was like, who is this? And of course, I thought it was a man because MFK Fisher, like you read that and it's, who is this?
Yeah.
And then I discovered, it was a woman, an American. And for me, it's the best writing I read. I have her whole work, and it's something I get often to get a read and to see like technically how she builds the stories, because also telling a dish, like the way of eating it, you can also add the same narrative structure that you would add to a micro tale or something. And yeah, I understand that after I recommended you also read some books of her or got some book of her.
Yeah, I have a couple of them, and it's true what you're saying. Like this multisensorial way of approaching writing about food is so telling of her writing. Like she's such a pro in doing that, and she has inspired so many other writers in that. Like, I don't know if it's a genre on its own, and it's truly like, it's very endearing, no? Like, it's like very touching, as you were mentioning, that she was describing a plate and then you felt all the aromas, and that's not easy to convey, I think, with literature. When you play with the senses, you have to be really good at it. and she's really good. Another writer that I really recommend that goes into that direction, she's alive, she's more contemporary, and her name is Tamar Adler. She has this book, An Everlasting Meal. I found her, I think, after MFK Fisher. That was your recommendation. And she has truly also changed my way of like approaching food in general. It's like these meditations about food more than just like describing a dish. They really go deep into like what that means, and it's like a philosophy in itself. I don't know. It's really inspiring because I also have a blog, or I try to keep it up. I haven't written in a while. It's linked to my publishing house that is called Concordia Press, in which I also talk a lot about plants. So I'm very interested in this intersection between plants and cooking with plants, and or fermenting or experimenting in general, but like more dealing with edible plants. So I also try to keep my pen sharp and write, but I've been working a lot, so it's a little bit dormant at the moment. It's not so active. But yeah, just going back to Tamar, she has been so inspiring, and also MFK Fisher, just talking about the writing perspective, like models of people who I look up to. Like I want to write like them because it's not easy. You have to practice a lot and eat a lot and cook a lot and be open to food.
Yeah. Well, what I think I have like a unfair advantage is of not only being a chef, but I have also been part of tasting panels where they train you to identify aromas, and also a lot of tastings. You see, there's people that when I'm not a pro, but I've seen this, like someone tasting a wine and using 20 descriptors and you go like, yeah, exactly. Yeah, tobacco, leather, exactly, blackberry, like
yogurt, milk.
You know what? One of the experiments they do when you're getting trained is they give you like a small thing to smell, and it's usually something really familiar. You know, I know what this is, but the words won't come out, and it's because you're just not trained. And then it's something like really obvious, like cinnamon. I knew it. You know, like this happens all the time. But as a chef, you get trained to that.
Yeah.
Tasting, a sauce, and you have to know what is missing because you already know the recipe, and then you say, the cardamom is missing, you know, or this kind of thing.
It's good. I mean, I'm super jealous because yes, you get to train a lot and like really build up your vocabulary. I remember when I got COVID the first time that I lost my sense of smell, I found myself reading and researching about smell, which is one of the senses that people tend to ignore the most. People tend to give more attention to, I don't know, the other senses. And with this pandemic, then there was kind of like a highlight on smelling, but that for chefs, I think it's like something so important because they're all the time like relying so much on smelling. And in my experience, because I have a lot of ferments, or I tend to have a lot of ferments at home, I also was like really, lacking on like, or I was missing a lot, like the fact that I could smell and really tell like, I have to feed my SCOBY, or I have to do this and this because I couldn't like smell things. But yeah, I am digressing. I just wanted to say that like for regular folks that do not work in the kitchen or are exposed to like dealing with vocabulary of smelling, it's really hard. Like it's really, that's why I'm jealous of you that.
There are like this, like what I just said, that you have this micro bottles with just an aroma. There are this set to train wine taster beginners. So you get a set of, 350 aromas. And it's like a game, you smell it and you have to, and after you start doing that, you realize you're starting to use a part of your brain you weren't using, like associating aromas with words. And that's quite interesting. And then also adding, of course, the layer of texture with, describing how the texture was and of course the whole context and the place. But I was talking just about food, but when you go to the broader of what is food, not only the sensory experience, of course, Anthony Bourdain.
Amazing.
And I'm pretty sure that he has had an influence on my writing for sure, and this podcast for sure. Like the kind of contents we deliver, he was doing that in 99, and he's still extremely influential. So you had another book, you sent me like a list of recommendations. More Home Cooking by Laurie Colwin. What can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, Laurie Colwin, I have it around here, More Home Cooking. This is a really interesting book in a way that it's very similar to what we were talking about, storytelling and so on. But it has a format that I really enjoyed a lot, like a hybrid of a writing book and a cookbook, like an essay book and a cookbook, because she divides this, like it's little fragments of stories, and each fragment ends up with a recipe.
Okay.
So it's linking perhaps a memory or perhaps an anecdote or anything that is really personal to her. And then at the end, she gives you a recipe that is linked to that memory. So for me, this is like, I want to do this. And especially because I think in Spanish, I haven't found a writer that has something similar. And I've been dealing a lot with like family recipes. So it's one format that I am also like looking a lot into to see if I do a format, something similar for a project, which is, like I said, like memories and then recipes and the familiarity in this connection, which I think it's lovely.
I think you would like, Mugaritz, the restaurant, like one of their first books. And they say themselves, and a lot of people say that it's kind of like when a band has their first album and all the cult fans, they say the first album is the best, and then they became something else. That kind of happens with that book of Mugaritz called Chlorophilia. And so they had like a complete different style of cooking back then, but every single recipe represents a herb, and most of them are wild herbs. And then you have the recipe, which is like a Michelin star level technical recipe. Mm-hmm. But then there's like, I don't know how to describe it. I would describe it like as a free writing from these authors that are not chefs. But these are like, fictitious anecdotes or almost poems in prose or, just like a pre-writing related to the herb, not to the dish. So you have this story about the herb, the recipe, and that's how the book goes. And back then they were doing like really interesting and creative approach to cookbooks. I remember another one they did, which is almost not known by a lot of people. I think the name is 35 millimeters. And they invited chefs from all over the world to make a recipe related to a scene in a movie.
Yeah, that's nice.
So I was working in a restaurant where the chef got invited. So I saw the whole invitation letter. They would get like the whole invitation, super formal of, we invite you to participate in this book, blah, 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 blah. Also with a DVD in the box, all with the branding of the book they were doing with the movie so that the chef could see the movie and cook something to it. And it's like these kind of books that are more conceptual, not exactly because you're going to use this to make a recipe, but you're just kind of like a aesthetic experience,
I like that very much. It made me think also that it's a different type of book, but also these ways of dealing with recipes that are a little bit more alternative to having like a list of ingredients and instructions. And I'm talking about Nigel Slater, that he has so many books, and he's so prolific. He has so much writing published, and his recipes are just long stories. Like when you see the books, it's just like a big paragraph, 3 pages, and then at the end, a list of ingredients, And I learned a lot more from that way of cooking, like that way of like, I don't know, presenting cookbooks. I'm not a trained chef. I wish I was. I'm just very curious about cooking. I cook a lot. I love it. And I learned a lot from cookbooks like that one, like the ones that present you recipes in a way that you can experiment yourself. And that's why, for example, Tamara Adler taught me a lot, because it's like, she says things like, when you salt things, you have to salt with your hands. So you get used to the feeling of like how much salt you need for things. Like when you say, this is a pinch, or this is, I don't know. And those are like simple things that when you're a trained chef and you have to practice and do a lot of things that I don't do in my kitchen, it's really helpful, because it gives you a lot of liberty and also room for experimentation and not feeling like you have to stick to one recipe to make it work, That I think a lot of people approach the cookbook like, if I change this, then it's going to taste bad, or it's going to be horrible. It's not going to work out. No, it's like you can always do some tweaks and trust yourself on like what you're smelling, what you're like tasting, especially that, like you taste things. People sometimes don't taste things while they cook.
No, of course. And that's also, it's also a way to develop your own palate and have fun while cooking and understanding what you like and what you don't. It's funny because professional recipes are exactly the opposite. They're just the list of ingredients and then the steps super straightforward, like 80 degrees, half time, let it rest, done. Like just 4 words, and that's a recipe.
That's why I'm not a chef. It's not my style.
So another one I have here from the list you sent me is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Sauner.
Yes. So this is also a memoir book, and it's a very heartbreaking story about how one daughter connects to her mother when she gets sick, and they connect through food. So they're Korean, and the daughter is Korean American. So she starts getting to know the food from Korea, cooking for her mom. Like she connects with her mom after having a very difficult relationship. And it goes like that story is just like this passage of like connecting daughter, mother, and then the mother dies. And like, at least she lives with this beautiful, connection to her through cooking. So it's really nice because also a lot of things that I didn't know about Korean food, especially like what I like the most also is like how food can be medicine somehow. The type of food that you eat when you're sick, the type of food that you eat when you're feeling that way or another is so embedded in what she's telling. And I really like her. She's also a musician. Actually, she's the lead singer of Japanese Breakfast, which is an amazing title for a band. So I also like the fact that she's coming from another place. Like I like hybrid things and like really things that come together from different angles. So I think that also was something that interests me a lot about this book. I really recommend.
Like a super classic, I would say, when it comes to food literature or narrative that involve food, I would say is Laura Esquivel's, how's the name? For Water and Chocolate.
Yeah, Paragua. In Spanish, I remember the most.
Como agua para chocolate.
Como agua para chocolate, yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading that as a kid, actually, and never again. And also the movie, I remember it was a super nice movie. Yeah, like this traditional Mexican cooking in a huge house, and there were a lot of super interesting recipes, and all with this layer of magic realism that you will find in a lot of Latin American literature.
Always in reality.
In Latin American reality as well.
Yeah, another book that is also, I think I didn't mention it in the list, but it's also really a catch. I think it was published in 2022. It's by Rebecca May Johnson, and it's called Small Fires. And it's about recipes in the way that, like, how she presents the book is that she repeats one recipe for I don't know how many 100 times. So she's all the time talking about the same recipe, but also reflecting on what is a recipe and how does a recipe behave in different contexts with different people. And I'm curious to pick your brain on it.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, because I mean, you as a chef, like you have to repeat something and you're striving for consistency, no? Like you have to make it like as consistent as possible because you're working.
No, but...
No?
But yes, you do. But in restaurants, recipes have an evolution. Like if you see in a restaurant, like a recipe at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, the recipe has changed because it has been optimized, hopefully for best, But you also get to see them changing for worst, like, now we're skipping this step because, like, actually you always want to simplify as much as possible. And especially in a restaurant, you don't want to make steps you could save or do things that don't have anything unless there is a reason for it, or unless you are a very, obsessive chef that wants like super, like complex technique. But also, I remember this chef, he has a super nice book also, Tetsuya Wakuda. He's like a Japanese Australian. He used to be very big 15 years ago. I think he still has a restaurant, but he used to be like regarded as one of the best chefs in the world back then in the 2000s. Not anymore. But yeah, he would talk about serving the same dish for 20 years, the same dish. One of his classics, it was a wild salmon, but that it would evolve through time, that it was not the same dish anymore, like that's also interesting.
I love this idea of this transformation in recipes. I do a workshop that I've been doing for several years now that is called Fermentation as a Metaphor. It's inspired by a book of Sandor Elix Katz that is called the same, Fermentation as Metaphor. And I do this, like it's fermentation and writing. I chose to work with sauerkraut because I think it's one of the easiest ferments, more like I don't know, it's a generous ferment because it's really hard to get it wrong. So I usually do these workshops in very short periods of time in which we work on a sauerkraut together. I teach the people like the basics of fermenting. And then we write a text that is based on this experience of doing sauerkraut. So I invite people to observe their own sauerkraut through, I don't know, a period of like 2 weeks, and then smell it and see how it behaves and the bubbles that arises and all of these things.
Name it. Very important.
Yes, name it, give it a name, all of that. So it's funny because the idea with it is that from the basis of the first exercise that we do, which is making this sauerkraut, we all have the same ingredients, but each sauerkraut will be different, of course. And then also all the writing will be different, even though we're like starting from the base. The base is the same. So it's the same ingredients and also like the same exercise they all have to do. So I've been repeating this workshop for a long time now. And I used to say to myself, oh, maybe I'll get bored because it's like doing the same over and over again. But I see how it's been transforming, and all the stories that come with it is so much fun because like people are like, their minds are just wonderful. Is that I've had like many beautiful encounters in which like, yeah, it's like you're doing the same and you're using the same, but it's always so different. And I really like that. I don't know if you have felt anything like that with recipes or with any type of like, I don't know, special plate that you repeat often.
I can recall like having a special relationship. No, actually a super common question that anybody who is a chef gets asked all the time. And at least I don't have an answer is what is your specialty? And I'm like, well, I don't have any, like I just do things, like, and most of the time, if I'm cooking at home, most of the time I'm freestyling. It's very, very rarely I will be following a recipe because I just want to have fun, because I have the technical knowledge. Otherwise, I would be worried from doing something wrong. You mentioned Sandor Katz. I met him. I went having pinchos and beers with him here in San Sebastian. Amazing guy. And he's incredible. and I was at a workshop with him. He was doing sauerkraut as well. And I really, really recommend his book, The Art of Fermentation.
Of course, a Bible.
It's an amazing book. And it's funny because my friends that are really fermentation freaks, like Diego Prado, when we were talking about that book, of course, he likes the book, but he's like, yeah, it's super nice, but it's a novel. Like, he's more like into technical books, like.
Yeah.
This was like too narrative, yeah. But yeah, it's nice to read a novel on fermentation and seeing all the different approaches and techniques and the stories behind it.
Well, of course, you see my tendency. So I'm more into storytelling. So I see that book, The Art of Fermentation, and it's like, wow, this is so cool because it's like he's telling you a whole story about where he learned to do this or that. And then in the middle, you have the technique, no? And so I really admire him a lot. He's been a huge reference for me, especially because he blends these topics that we're talking about. Like this storytelling is super important to him, but he's also a very, when you're dealing with that amount of fermentation knowledge, you do have to get technical. You cannot improvise that much at some point.
Yeah, it's a lot of information in that book for sure.
A lot. So cool that you met him.
Yeah, the other book that I really like, I don't know if you know this one, The Third Plate by Dan Barber.
Yes, I have it here.
Because that's a chef and also storytelling, and it talks a lot about food systems and also kind of like a journalist approach about specific chefs and producers and the story. and everything. And yeah, I think it's quite cool. It's a super good read for sure.
Yeah, I think it has also this political view of food, and he's working from his so his baseline is restaurants, no, and it gets really political. I really like that. It made me think on one of the books that I sent you by Alice Waters, Coming to My Senses. And it's this memoir about like her developing Japanese and all of the political struggles as well in between, and why she decided to go to choose this path, because when she started, there was not like this concept of farm to table, or not as she started developing, at least that I know of.
That's something I could read, because I'm a big fan of Alice Waters, and she's hugely influential in all the restaurant movement, especially in the West Coast in the United States. But I've never read one of her books. I've read articles, opinions, quotes, these kind of things, recipes, but never one of her books. So this might be something I could get. I'm not reading from a few years on. I've been just listening to audiobooks, because it's my way of consuming books. Like, I get the audiobooks and I go for a walk. It's better than laying on the couch. So I do two things at a time. And it's a different way to consume the same content. And yeah, I've been thinking, especially with long books, I do that, because I rather having walks. Some like a long novel can last like 30 hours of audiobook.
It's also very useful, no? Because we're on the go a lot. So yeah, it's true that with books, you have to have a pause from all this movement in which we're involved to an everyday basis. It made me think, like, I was curious because I really like podcasts about food in general. So I appreciate the work you're doing because it's really fun. Also, like, it's really meditative for me when people actually explain recipes. It's really interesting. I don't know. It's like I've been listening to a few podcasts that they just like talk about recipes. And it's funny because when people are linking to the storytelling, they're telling you about the food. It's really soothing for me.
Yeah, I guess it's like, I once heard from a TV chef. He was saying that some study proved that 99% of the people that watch TV shows don't cook the recipes. Like, they just enjoy watching the cooking. It's like a way of entertaining in itself.
That's it for this week's episode of Potluck Food Talks. If you like what we're doing, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok as Potluck Food Talks. The show airs every Monday.